The gray sky over Cleveland seemed to mourn Alicia Turner, along with everyone gathered in the small living room of Ruth Robinson's house. The elderly woman sat in an armchair, clutching a photograph of her daughter, her face frozen in an expression of endless grief. It had been only 3 days since 30-year-old Alicia had left this world, leaving behind only memories and a heavy, oppressive feeling of emptiness. Keisha Robinson stood by the window, watching the raindrops hit the glass. At 25, she never thought she would be burying her older sister. Her gaze involuntarily shifted to the opposite corner of the room, where David Turner, Alicia's widower, was talking to someone on the phone. She noticed that his voice sounded too businesslike for a man who had lost his wife just 3 days ago. "Yes, of course, we can discuss it after the funeral," David said, ending the conversation. "I'll be in touch." He put his phone in his pocket and, noticing Keisha's gaze, nodded at her with a forced smile. The 35-year-old businessman always gave the impression of being in complete control, even now when his life was about to fall apart. "David," the voice of Jamal Harris, a longtime friend of the family, broke the awkward silence. "Have you contacted the church about the service?" "It's all taken care of," David replied, unable to hide his irritation. "I'm on it." Keisha watched the brief exchange, feeling an inexplicable tension building inside her. Something about David's behavior seemed wrong, fake. She had always felt a certain distrust of her sister's husband, but she had never been able to explain why. Now that feeling was amplified 100-fold. "Mom, you need to rest," Keisha said, walking over to Ruth and gently placing her hand on her shoulder. "I'll make some tea." "I can't believe it," Ruth whispered, unable to take her eyes off the photo. She was so healthy, so full of life. How could this happen so suddenly? That question had haunted Keisha ever since she learned of her sister's death. The official diagnosis was heart failure, but Alicia had never complained of heart problems. She had been sick quite often over the past few months and complained of fatigue, but nothing had foreshadowed such an outcome. Keisha was mechanically making tea in the kitchen when she heard footsteps behind her. Turning around, she saw David. "We need to discuss some details about the funeral," he said dryly. "I think it's best to keep it simple, without any unnecessary pomp and circumstance." "Alicia deserves a proper send-off," Keisha objected, trying to contain her growing irritation. "She loved flowers and music. We have to respect her wishes." "Her wishes?" David's voice was tinged with sarcasm. "She never discussed her funeral, Keisha. Let's be realistic." "How do you know? Have you even spoken to her recently?" The words slipped out before she could stop them. David's face twisted for a moment, but he quickly regained control. "I was her husband, Keisha. It's not for you to judge our relationship." With that, he turned and left the kitchen, leaving Keisha with a heavy feeling of unfinished business and growing suspicions. That evening, when most of the visitors had left, Keisha helped her mother get ready for bed. Ruth looked exhausted, as if the years had weighed heavily on her with every passing hour. "Mom," Keisha began cautiously, "don't you find it strange that Alicia died so suddenly? She never had any heart problems." Ruth sighed as she sat down on the edge of the bed. "David said the doctors weren't surprised. She had signs, we just didn't notice." "I don't know, honey. We didn't see each other much in the last few months." It was true. After her marriage to David, Alicia had started visiting her family less often. At first, everyone attributed it to the young family's busy schedule, but over time the visits became so rare that Keisha began to worry. "She didn't look happy, Mom," Keisha said quietly. "The last time I saw her, she seemed kind of dull." "David says it was because of her illness," Ruth replied, but there was doubt in her voice. Keisha decided not to pursue the conversation, seeing how difficult it was for her mother. After putting Ruth to bed, she returned to the living room, where she found Jamal clearing away empty cups. "You don't have to do that," she said gratefully. "I want to help," he replied simply. "How are you holding up?" Keisha had known Jamal practically her whole life. He had grown up in the neighborhood, was friends with her family, and had always been there for them in difficult times. "I don't know, Jamal," she admitted honestly. "Something's bothering me. Alicia shouldn't have died, not now, not like this." Jamal looked at her intently. "What are you talking about?" "I'm a nurse, Jamal. I saw Alicia's symptoms over the last few months. It was like, she faltered, frightened by the thought that had entered her mind. Like what? Jamal insisted. Chronic poisoning, Keisha whispered. Fatigue, nausea, periodic stomach pains. She blamed it on stress, but… Keisha! Jamal put his hands on her shoulders. Do you realize what you're saying? That's a serious accusation. I'm not accusing anyone, she defended herself. I need to know the truth, Jamal. I need to make sure Alicia's death was natural. Keisha spent the next 2 days trying to gather information about her sister's last months. She used her position as a nurse to gain access to Alicia's medical records. The test results showed strange abnormalities that didn't quite match the diagnosis of heart failure. In the evening, after another day of funeral preparations, Keisha decided to visit Alicia and David's house. She knew David would be away. He had mentioned an important meeting with business partners. The house greeted her with an oppressive silence. Keisha slowly walked through the rooms, touching her sister's belongings, trying to feel her presence. In the bedroom, she noticed a bedside table with medicines. Among them were drugs that Alicia had been taking in recent months. Keisha carefully studied the labels but found nothing suspicious. Deciding to check David's study, she found the door locked. This seemed strange. The study had always been open before. After searching for a few minutes, Keisha found a spare key in a drawer in the hall. The office was perfectly tidy, with not a single piece of paper out of place on the desk. Keisha began to carefully check the desk drawers. In the bottom drawer, under a stack of documents, she found a folder labeled Insurance. Opening it, Keisha felt the ground slip away beneath her feet. Before her lay an insurance policy in the name of Alicia Turner for $2 million. The policy had been taken out by Alicia's parents before her marriage, but the beneficiary was listed as her husband, David Turner. With trembling hands, Keisha leafed through the documents and found a letter from the insurance company dated just a week earlier, confirming that the payment process had begun. David had already filed a claim. "What are you doing here?" David's voice came from the door, making Keisha jump. She hadn't heard him come back. "I just wanted to be around Alicia's things," she lied, trying to discreetly put the folder back in its place. "In my office?" he asked coldly, approaching her. "I was looking for photos for the funeral," Keisha continued, backing away. "I thought maybe you had some good pictures." David looked at the desk and noticed the folder partially visible in the drawer. "You were going through my papers," he said, not as a question but as a statement. "What right did you have? What right did you have not to tell us about the $2 million insurance policy?" Keisha blurted out, realizing there was no point in hiding. David's face twisted with anger for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "It was Alicia's policy, and only she and I knew about it. It's our personal business and has nothing to do with her family." "Our parents took out that policy," Keisha exclaimed, "and you've already filed a claim. Alicia's body isn't even buried yet, and you're already counting the money." "Get out," David said quietly but firmly. "Get out of my house right now." "Alicia didn't die a natural death," the words came out on their own. "And I'll prove it." David took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. "Be careful with your accusations, Keisha. You have no idea what you're getting yourself into." At that moment, Keisha realized that her suspicions were not unfounded. Something in David's eyes, in his voice, confirmed her worst fears. "The funeral is the day after tomorrow," David said, breaking the heavy silence. "I expect you to behave appropriately, for Alicia's sake." Keisha silently walked past him toward the exit. Fragments of thoughts and facts swirled in her head, forming a terrifying picture. She needed proof, and she had very little time to find it. When she got home, Keisha found Jamal helping Ruth organize the funeral reception. "I need to talk to you," she whispered, and Jamal could tell from her face that something serious had happened. They went out to the back porch, where Keisha, making sure no one could hear them, told him about the insurance policy she had found. $2 million, Jamal. That's motive enough, isn't it?" Jamal shook his head thoughtfully. "It's only circumstantial evidence, Keisha. Many people insure their lives. That doesn't make their husbands murderers." "But it explains David's strange behavior," she insisted, "and Alicia's symptoms before she died." I need to get the toxicology results. How are you going to do that? Jamal asked anxiously. The test has already been done and the results didn't show anything suspicious. Otherwise, the police would already be on the case. There are poisons that are difficult to detect in a standard test, Keisha replied, especially if the poisoning was gradual, in small doses. I need to check the medications Alicia was taking. The next day, the last day before the funeral, the tension reached its peak. Keisha couldn't sleep, constantly thinking about her theory and how to get proof. She went back to the hospital where she worked, hoping to find someone she knew in the toxicology lab. She was in luck. Her friend Marcus was on duty. After much persuasion, he agreed to run additional tests on the samples Keisha had secretly taken from David's house, the remains of Alicia's medication. It will take time, Keisha, Marcus warned. I can't promise any results for a few days. The funeral is tomorrow, she said desperately. I need to know the truth before we bury Alicia. I'll do everything I can, Marcus promised, seeing her state. Call me in the morning. That evening, the family gathered at Ruth's house for a final meeting before the funeral. David kept his distance, barely speaking to Alicia's relatives. Keisha watched him, making no attempt to hide her dislike. We need to be at the church by 10 tomorrow, David announced before leaving. Everything is organized, all you need to do is show up. When he left, Keisha hugged her mother, feeling her tremble with suppressed tears. Everything will be okay, Mom, she whispered, even though she didn't believe her own words. We'll get through this. Early in the morning, while the house was still asleep, Keisha's phone rang. It was Marcus. Keisha, you were right. His voice sounded agitated. The pills you brought in contain arsenic. It's a small dose, but with regular use... He killed her, Keisha breathed, feeling everything inside her grow cold. David poisoned Alicia for the insurance money. You need to go to the police, Marcus insisted. You have proof. Keisha thanked her friend and hung up without answering his last question. She was overcome with cold rage. The funeral would begin in a few hours. Alicia would be laid to rest and her killer would stand beside her, pretending to be a grieving widower. She couldn't let that happen. St. Michael's Church was filled with people long before the ceremony began. Black silhouettes, muffled voices, the scent of lilies and roses decorating the coffin. Everything created an atmosphere of deep mourning. Keisha stood next to her mother in the front row, her eyes fixed on Alicia's photo next to the coffin. In the picture, her sister was smiling, bright, full of life, nothing like the pale, tormented woman she had become in her final months. David arrived accompanied by several men in formal suits, business partners, as he introduced them. His face was a perfect mask of grief, but his eyes remained dry and cold. He nodded briefly to Ruth and barely acknowledged Keisha before taking his seat. The priest began the service, his voice quiet and measured, echoing through the church, speaking of life, death, and eternal rest. Keisha could barely hear his words. Only one thought pulsed through her mind. The man who poisoned her sister was sitting just a few steps away from her, pretending to be a grieving widower. David Turner would like to say a few words about his late wife, announced the priest, and David rose, heading for the pulpit. Alicia was the light of my life, he began, his voice trembling slightly, but his eyes remained dry. Our 5 years together were filled with love and understanding. Her passing is an irreplaceable loss for all of us. Keisha clenched her fists so tightly that her nails dug into her palms. Every word David said seemed like a blasphemous lie to her. She glanced at her mother. Ruth was crying quietly, pressing a handkerchief to her face. I promised to keep her memory in my heart until the end of my days, David concluded, and at those words, Keisha couldn't take it anymore. She jumped up and ran out of the church. Outside, she gulped down the cool autumn air, trying to calm down. A few minutes later, the church door opened again and Jamal appeared beside her. Are you okay? He asked quietly. No, Keisha replied honestly. I can't listen to him lie standing over her coffin. It's unbearable. I understand, Jamal said, placing his hand on her shoulder. But you have to hold on, for Ruth's sake. She needs you now. Keisha took a deep breath and nodded. They returned to the church just as the service was ending. The farewell procession began, with those in attendance taking turns approaching the open casket to see Alicia one last time. When it was Keisha's turn, she leaned over her sister, staring at her peaceful face. The funeral home makeup artists had tried to restore her to the way she had looked before her illness, but Keisha found it almost sacrilegious to hide the traces of the suffering Alicia had gone through. "I swear he'll pay for this," she whispered, barely touching her sister's cold forehead with her lips. After the ceremony, the procession headed for the cemetery. The sky clouded over and a light rain began to fall, as if nature itself were mourning with them. The coffin was lowered into the ground, the priest said the final prayers, and those present took turns throwing handfuls of earth onto the coffin lid. When it was over, Ruth, supported by Jamal, headed for the car. Keisha lingered at the grave, unable to leave. "We have to go!" David's voice sounded unexpectedly close. "The memorial service will begin in an hour." Keisha turned to him, struggling to contain her rage. "How can you stand here so calmly, knowing what you've done?" David looked around to make sure no one could hear them. "I don't know what you're talking about, Keisha," he replied quietly. "But I advise you to watch your words, especially on a day like this." "I know about the arsenic," she blurted out. "I found it in Alicia's medicine." For a moment, David's face changed. Fear flashed in his eyes, but he quickly regained his composure. "You're delusional," he said coldly. "Grief has clouded your mind." With that, he turned and walked toward his car, leaving Keisha standing by her sister's grave. The memorial service was held at David and Alicia's house. Keisha didn't want to go, but she knew she had to, for her mother's sake, and to keep an eye on David. While the guests gathered in the living room, she slipped quietly into her sister's bedroom, hoping to find more evidence. In the closet, deep in a drawer with underwear, she found a small, leather-bound diary. Keisha's heart raced. She had never seen it before. Opening it at random, she saw Alicia's neat handwriting. "Yesterday was bad again. David says it's just stress, but I feel like that's not it. I've had these strange symptoms for a month now. Maybe I should see another doctor, but David insists that Dr. Harris is the best in town." Flipping through a few pages, Keisha found a more recent entry. "I found some documents in David's office. His business is on the verge of bankruptcy. Millions in debt, the threat of losing everything. He doesn't know I saw the papers. Now I understand why he's been so nervous lately, but there's something else, something I don't know. He's been acting strange, especially when he brings me my medication." The last entry was dated a week before Alicia's death. "I'm almost certain that David is putting something in my medication. I didn't take it today. I threw the pills in the toilet. I think I'm starting to feel better. Tomorrow I'll talk to Keisha. She'll know what to do. I'm scared." That was where the entries ended. Keisha felt nausea rising in her throat. Alicia knew. She had figured out what was going on, but it was too late. Jamal entered the bedroom, his face looking worried. "Keisha, everyone's looking for you." "What did you find?" She silently handed him the diary, and he quickly scanned the last few pages. "My God," he gasped. "You were right all along. We need to go to the police right now." "No," Keisha replied firmly. "First, I want to hear him admit it himself." "Keisha, it's dangerous. If he realizes you know, he won't hurt me in front of all these people." Keisha nodded toward the living room, where muffled voices could be heard. "Please, Jamal, let me talk to him first." Jamal hesitated, but finally nodded reluctantly. "All right, but I'll stay close. And if he refuses to talk, we go straight to the police." They returned to the guests. Keisha found David talking to one of his business partners. Noticing her, he apologized and walked away. "Where were you?" he asked irritably. "People are asking for you." "I need to talk to you," Keisha replied. "Alone." David frowned but nodded. "In my office, in 5 minutes." Keisha headed for the office, feeling the tension building inside her. She didn't know what she was going to say to him, but she was determined to get him to admit the truth. Jamal tried to follow her, but she stopped him. "Wait here. If something goes wrong, you'll be close by." Entering the office, Keisha placed Alicia's diary on the desk. She wanted David to see it right away. A few minutes later, the door opened and he entered, closing it tightly behind him. "What did you want to talk about?" he began, but then his gaze fell on the diary. His face froze. "Where did you get this?" "In Alicia's bedroom," Keisha replied, not taking her eyes off him. "She knew, David. She knew you were poisoning her." David slowly walked over to the desk, picked up the diary, and flipped through it, his face becoming more and more tense. "This doesn't prove anything," he finally said. "Just the paranoid thoughts of a sick woman." "I have proof," Keisha objected. "I found arsenic in her medicine. I've already sent samples to the lab. The police will have all the evidence soon." David looked up at her, and Keisha felt a chill. His eyes were completely empty. "You think they'll believe you?" he sneered. "A hysterical sister who can't accept the death of a loved one? Against me, a respected businessman and inconsolable widower?" "I think they'll believe Alicia's diary and the toxicology report," Keisha replied. "And they'll be interested in your failing business and your $2 million life insurance policy." David's face contorted with rage. "You don't understand," he exclaimed. "I was on the verge of complete ruin. I needed that money to save everything I'd built over the years." "So you decided to kill my sister?" Keisha felt tears of rage welling up in her throat. "Slowly poison her for months, watching her fade away day by day?" "She didn't feel anything," David said, his voice tinged with self-justification. "It was almost like a natural death. I took care of her until the end." "You're a monster," Keisha breathed, "and you'll pay for everything you've done." She turned to leave, but David grabbed her arm sharply. "Where are you going?" His voice became threatening. "You think I'm going to let you ruin everything? Let me go." Keisha tried to break free, but his grip was too strong. "First, we'll make a deal," David said. "I can offer you a share. 500,000, enough to start a new life. All you have to do is forget what you think you know." "You're offering me money? Money for my sister's life?" Keisha couldn't believe her ears. "Be reasonable," David insisted. "What will you gain by sending me to prison? It won't bring Alicia back, but the money will help you and your mother." Keisha felt something break inside her. She saw Alicia's face flash before her eyes, pale, tortured, with dark circles under her eyes. Her older sister, who had always protected her, who deserved better. "You'll never get that money," she hissed through clenched teeth. "I'll do everything I can to make sure you rot in prison for the rest of your life." David's face contorted with rage. He shoved Keisha hard against the wall, and she hit her head on a bookshelf. Her vision darkened for a moment. "Then I have no choice," he hissed, closing in on her. "We'll have to solve this problem another way." Another tragic death on the day of the funeral. What a sad coincidence. Keisha tried to scream, but David's hand clamped over her mouth. With his other hand, he grabbed her throat and began to squeeze. Keisha struggled desperately, scratching his hands, trying to break free. David was stronger, his face contorted in a grimace of mad determination. Out of the corner of her eye, Keisha noticed a heavy paperweight on the table. Summoning her last ounce of strength, she reached for it and, breaking free from David's grip for a split second, grabbed the heavy object and struck him on the head with all her might. David recoiled, clutching his head. His face reflected surprise, which quickly gave way to a new wave of rage. Blood was flowing down his temple, but he didn't seem to notice. "You'll regret this," he growled, lunging at her again. At that moment, Keisha saw a paper knife on the table, long with a sharp blade. Without hesitation, she grabbed it and held it in front of her. "Don't come near me!" she shouted. "I'll call the police! It's over, David!" But he didn't stop. With a growl, he lunged at her, and the knife went into his chest. Keisha felt the blade pass through the fabric of his jacket and shirt and sink into his body. David froze, his eyes wide with shock and pain. For a few seconds, they stood motionless, staring at each other. Then David slowly sank to his knees, still clutching the knife handle sticking out of his chest. A trickle of blood flowed from his mouth. You, he tried to say, but couldn't finish the sentence. His eyes rolled back and he collapsed to the floor. Keisha stood paralyzed with horror at what had just happened. Her hands were covered in David's blood, and her heart was beating so hard it felt like it was about to jump out of her chest. The office door flew open, and Jamal appeared in the doorway. His gaze darted from Keisha to David lying on the floor, and he froze in shock. "My God, Keisha, what have you done?" he gasped. He tried to kill me," she whispered, still unable to believe what was happening. "Like he killed Alicia." Jamal quickly approached David and checked his pulse. "He's dead," he said quietly, looking up at Keisha. At that moment, voices and footsteps could be heard in the hallway. One of the guests had heard the noise and was heading toward the study. Jamal quickly locked the door and turned to Keisha. "Listen to me," he said, taking her by the shoulders. "You have to tell the truth, the whole truth, about how he poisoned Alicia, about how he tried to kill you when you exposed him. You have proof, the diary, the medicine. It was self-defense, Keisha." She nodded slowly, still in shock. "I didn't want to kill him," she whispered. "I just wanted him to confess, to answer for what he did to Alicia." There was a knock at the door. Ruth's voice sounded concerned. "Keisha?" "David? What's going on? Open up." Jamal looked questioningly at Keisha, and she nodded. He opened the door, and several people, including Ruth, froze in the doorway when they saw the bloody scene. "Oh my God!" Ruth exclaimed, pressing her hands to her mouth. "Call the police," Jamal said calmly to one of the guests. "There's been a murder." The next half hour passed in a blur. Someone called the police and an ambulance, although it was clear that David was beyond help. The guests left the house in shock, some crying, others whispering. Ruth sat in the living room, pale as a sheet, unable to believe that on the day of her eldest daughter's funeral, she could lose her youngest as well. When the police arrived, Keisha was still in the study, sitting on a chair next to David's body. She wasn't crying or screaming. She just stared blankly at one spot. "Miss Robinson?" The police officer approached her cautiously. "I need to ask you a few questions." Keisha looked up at him and said calmly, "I killed him. He poisoned my sister for the insurance money, and when I exposed him, he tried to kill me too." The officer looked at her closely, then at David's body, noticing signs of a struggle in the room. "You'll have to come with us to the station, Miss Robinson," he said in an official tone. "You have the right to remain silent." Keisha didn't listen to the standard warning about her rights. Her gaze was fixed on the photo of Alicia standing on David's desk. In the picture, her sister was smiling, and Keisha thought she could see relief in that smile now. "I'm ready," she said, standing up. "I'll tell you the whole truth." The officers handcuffed her and led her out of the office. In the hallway, she saw Jamal holding Alicia's diary. "I'm coming with you," he said firmly. "And I'm taking this with me. They need to know the truth." Keisha nodded gratefully. As they passed through the living room, Ruth rushed toward her daughter. "Keisha, what happened? What have you done?" Her voice was filled with despair and fear. "Everything will be okay, Mom," Keisha replied quietly. "David killed Alicia. I found the evidence. He poisoned her for the insurance money." Ruth recoiled, shaken by the revelation. "Is that true?" she asked Jamal, who nodded silently, showing her the diary. "I have to go with the police, Mom," Keisha continued. "But I don't regret what I did, not after what he did to Alicia." The officers gently but firmly led her to the door. At the threshold, Keisha turned and saw Ruth slump into a chair, covering her face with her hands. For the first time in this entire nightmare, Keisha felt tears streaming down her cheeks. As the police car drove away from the house, Keisha looked out the window at the gray sky and whispered, "I'm sorry, Alicia. I couldn't save you, but I made sure he paid for everything." Detective Michael Brown had been with the Cuyahoga County Police Department for over 15 years. During that time, he had seen many murders, from violent crimes committed in the heat of the moment to coldly planned executions. But the case of Keisha Robinson was special. A murder committed on the day of a funeral, in front of dozens of witnesses, was rare even in his extensive career. Sitting at his desk in his office, Brown leafed through the case files. In front of him were photos from the crime scene, the coroner's report on David Turner's death, a copy of Alicia's diary, and a preliminary report on the toxicology of her medications. The puzzle was starting to come together, but many pieces were still missing. There was a knock at the door, and a young female officer entered the office. "Detective, the results of the exhumation of Alicia Turner's body are in," she said, handing him a folder of documents. Brown nodded and took the folder. The exhumation had been carried out on the second day after David's murder, when Keisha's testimony and the diary found gave sufficient grounds for suspicion. "Thanks, Martinez. Please bring Keisha Robinson in for questioning in an hour." Left alone, the detective opened the folder and immersed himself in reading. What he saw confirmed Keisha's words. Traces of arsenic were found in Alicia's body tissues in amounts significantly exceeding normal background levels. The poisoning was slow, stretching over months, which led to a gradual deterioration in her health and, ultimately, heart failure. Brown leaned back in his chair, thinking about the information he had received. Now he had to find out if David Turner was the only person responsible for his wife's death and what his motives were. An hour later, Keisha was brought into the interrogation room. After 4 days in the detention center, she looked haggard, with dark circles under her eyes. But her gaze remained clear and determined. "Miss Robinson," Brown began, sitting down across from her, "we have received the results of the autopsy on your sister's body. Arsenic was found in her system." Keisha nodded, as if she had heard something she had been waiting to hear for a long time. "I knew it," she said quietly. "I saw all the symptoms. As a nurse, I should have realized sooner." "Tell me again how you found your sister's diary," the detective asked. Keisha took a deep breath and began to speak. She told him how, after the funeral, during the memorial service, she had gone to Alicia's bedroom, hoping to find more evidence to support her suspicions. She told him how she had found the diary hidden among the clothes and what she had read in it. "Alicia suspected that David was poisoning her," Keisha said, her voice trembling with suppressed emotion. "She was going to talk to me, but she didn't have time." "What about the insurance policy?" Brown asked. "I found the documents in his office the day before the funeral. $2 million. Motivation enough, don't you think?" The detective nodded, making notes in his notebook. "We checked Mr. Turner's financial situation," he said. "He was indeed on the verge of bankruptcy. His debts exceeded his assets by more than 2 to 1. "He confessed to me," Keisha said quietly. "Before he tried to kill me, he said he needed the money to save the business." "And then you stabbed him with a paper knife?" Keisha looked straight into the detective's eyes. "It was self-defense. He was choking me. I didn't want to kill him. I was just defending myself." Brown studied her face closely, trying to determine if she was telling the truth. Traces of David's skin were found on Keisha's neck and under her fingernails, confirming her version of the struggle. "I believe you, Miss Robinson," he finally said, "but the final decision will be up to the court." After questioning Keisha, Detective Brown met with Jamal Harris. The family friend looked tired but determined. "She's telling the truth, Detective," Jamal said as soon as they sat down. "Keisha suspected David from the beginning. She told me about her fears, but we didn't think it was that serious." "You were in the house when the murder took place," Brown pointed out. "Tell me what you saw." Jamal described how Keisha and David had gone into the study, how he had waited in the hallway, worried about her, and how he had heard the sound of a struggle. "When I went in, David was already lying on the floor, and Keisha was standing over him, covered in blood. She was in shock, Detective. This wasn't premeditated murder." Brown nodded, writing down the testimony. "What about the relationship between David and Alicia? Did you notice anything unusual?" Jamal thought for a moment. "Alicia changed a lot over the last year. She became withdrawn and rarely visited her family. David was always around, controlling her every move. We thought he was just looking out for her because of her illness. But now I realize he was making sure she didn't tell anyone about her suspicions." Over the next 2 weeks, Detective Brown conducted dozens of witness interviews, examined David Turner's financial records, and received the final results of the toxicology report on Alicia's body. The picture became crystal clear. David had been systematically poisoning his wife with arsenic, mixing it into her medication. His motive was a $2 million insurance policy that would save his failing business. One of the key pieces of evidence was the testimony of Dr. Harris, Alicia's attending physician. He admitted that David had insisted on a specific diagnosis and treatment, often remaining alone with his wife while she was taking her medication. "I never suspected anything like this," the doctor admitted bitterly. He seemed like such a caring husband. An analysis of David's computer revealed search queries about arsenic, its properties, and how to detect it. Traces of the substance were also found in his home laboratory. David, being a chemist by training, had all the knowledge necessary to carry out his plan. All these facts were presented to the district attorney, who, after reviewing the case, decided to charge Keisha with manslaughter rather than first-degree murder, as originally planned. This meant the possibility of a suspended sentence or minimal prison time. Keisha Robinson's trial began 3 months after David Turner's death. The courtroom was packed. The story of the double tragedy in the Robinson-Turner family had attracted the attention of not only local residents, but also the national media. Keisha sat at the defense table, next to her lawyer, Mark Collins, an experienced attorney specializing in self-defense cases. Ruth sat in the front row of the courtroom, supported by Jamal. The elderly woman's face was hidden behind a dark veil, but even through it, it was clear how difficult the trial was for her. "It'll be okay," Jamal whispered, squeezing Ruth's hand. "The truth is on our side." The judge, an elderly woman with a sharp gaze, entered the courtroom and took her seat. The trial began. The prosecutor, a young, ambitious man named Richard Garcia, presented the charges. He acknowledged that David Turner was guilty of killing his wife, but insisted that Keisha Robinson had exceeded the limits of necessary self-defense. "Ms. Robinson could have called the police, she could have left the house, she could have called for help," he said, addressing the jury. Instead, she chose the path of violence, taking justice into her own hands. Keisha's lawyer, on the other hand, emphasized that his client was acting in a state of severe emotional distress, having just buried her sister and learned that her death was the result of deliberate poisoning. "Imagine her state of mind," he said to the jury. A woman who has lost her beloved sister discovers that it was not a natural death, that the man who was supposed to love and care for her sister cold-bloodedly killed her for money. And then, when she tries to get justice, he attacks her, trying to silence her forever. Over the next few days, the court heard testimony from witnesses. Detective Brown gave a detailed account of his investigation, presenting all the evidence against David Turner. Medical experts confirmed that Alicia Turner died of arsenic poisoning, not heart failure, as stated in the original death certificate. Jamal Harris described how Alicia had changed in the last months of her life, how David controlled her every move, and how Keisha tried to make sense of what was happening. Ruth Robinson's testimony was particularly moving. The elderly woman struggled to hold back tears as she spoke about her daughters. "Alicia was always strong," she said in a trembling voice. "She took care of Keisha since she was a child, protected her, and now Keisha was trying to protect her sister's memory. I don't condone murder, but I understand what drove my daughter. It was love and a sense of justice." Finally, it was Keisha's turn to testify. She recounted in detail her suspicions, the diary she had found, and her confrontation with David in his office. "I didn't want to kill him," she said, looking straight at the jury. "I wanted him to confess, to answer for Alicia's death before the law. But when he started choking me, I realized he wouldn't stop. I acted instinctively, defending my life." During cross-examination, the prosecutor attempted to cast doubt on her version of events. "Miss Robinson, you're a nurse, aren't you?" he asked. "You know where to strike to cause a fatal injury?" "I know anatomy, yes," Keisha replied calmly. "But at that moment I wasn't thinking about that. I was just trying to stop him." "Didn't you try to call for help? To scream? There were a lot of people in the house. It all happened so fast. He attacked me right after I accused him of killing Alicia. I didn't have time to think." The closing arguments were emotional and compelling. The prosecutor insisted that, despite the circumstances, murder was murder, and Keisha should be punished. The defense emphasized the element of self-defense and the special circumstances of the case. The jury retired to deliberate for more than 8 hours. When they returned, the courtroom was tense and silent. "Have the jury reached a verdict?" asked the judge. "Yes, Your Honor," replied the foreman, an elderly man with gray hair. "On the charge of manslaughter, we find the defendant guilty." Ruth sobbed quietly, and Jamal put his arm around her shoulders. Keisha remained outwardly calm, although a single tear rolled down her cheek. "However," the foreman continued, We recommend that the court show the maximum leniency in sentencing, considering all the circumstances of the case. The judge nodded and announced that the sentence would be handed down in a week. That week dragged on endlessly for Keisha and her loved ones. Ruth came to visit her every day, bringing her food from home and news. Jamal organized a petition in support of Keisha among the local residents. More than 2,000 people signed the petition asking for a lenient sentence. Finally, the day of the verdict arrived. The judge carefully reviewed all the case materials, the jury's recommendations, and Keisha's character references from her workplace and acquaintances. "Stand up, defendant," said the judge, and Keisha rose, maintaining her dignity and composure. "The court finds you guilty of manslaughter." However, considering all the circumstances of the case, especially the element of self-defense and the fact that the victim himself was guilty of the premeditated murder of your sister, the court sentences you to 5 years probation with mandatory community service in a medical facility. A sigh of relief swept through the courtroom. Ruth burst into tears, this time of joy. Keisha stood motionless, not fully realizing what this meant for her freedom. "The court is adjourned," the judge announced, banging her gavel. Keisha turned to her mother and Jamal, who were already rushing toward her. For the first time in many months, she felt the weight on her heart lift a little. A few days later, after completing all the formalities, Keisha returned home. Ruth's house welcomed her with warmth and care. On the walls hung photographs of Alicia, smiling, happy, just as she had been before she met David. In the evening, after Ruth had gone to bed, Keisha went out to the back porch, where Jamal was waiting for them with cups of hot tea. "How are you?" he asked, handing her a cup. "I don't know," Keisha replied honestly. "Sometimes I feel like this is all a terrible dream, that I'll wake up and Alicia will be alive, and none of this will have happened." "You did everything you could," Jamal said gently. "You got justice for her." "Justice?" Keisha said thoughtfully. "You know, I had a lot of time to think in prison. I thought about what justice is. David is dead, but that didn't bring Alicia back. I avoided prison, but that didn't heal the pain. Maybe real justice isn't retribution, but the chance to move on while keeping the memory of those we've lost alive." Jamal nodded thoughtfully. "What are you going to do now?" he asked after a pause. "The judge assigned me to community service at a hospice," Keisha replied. "I'll be helping people who don't have much time left. It seems right. Alicia always said I was born to help others." They fell silent, gazing up at the starry sky. The noise of the city could be heard in the distance, but here, on the quiet porch, time seemed to stand still. "The insurance money," Keisha said suddenly. "It was awarded to my mother as Alicia's next of kin. She decided to set up a fund to help victims of domestic violence. She's going to name it after Alicia." "That's a wonderful idea," Jamal smiled. "Alicia would have approved." Keisha nodded, feeling tears welling up in her eyes. But they weren't just tears of grief. They were also tears of hope. Hope that even from the darkest tragedy, something bright could be born. "Thank you for being there for me," she said quietly, touching Jamal's hand. "I couldn't have done it without you." "I'll always be here," he replied simply, "for as long as you need me." A few days later, Keisha started her job at the hospice. Caring for the dying, she found strange comfort in being able to ease their final days. Each time she helped someone, she felt that a part of Alicia lived on in her actions. In the evenings, she helped her mother organize the foundation, which was gradually gaining momentum. The stories of the Robinson sisters and David Turner drew attention to the problem of domestic violence, and many people responded by offering help and support. Life went on, but the memory of Alicia remained with them, not as a heavy burden, but as a light guiding the way forward. And in that, perhaps, lay true justice.